welcome everyone. We're going to get started since it is now 1:48. I just want to say again, welcome to our keynote panel, Stories from Centering Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Accessibility at Outdoor School. My name is Sharissa Jones. I also go by Sharzi. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Outreach and Inclusion Coordinator for the OSU Extension Outdoor School Program, which is a statewide position. I'm also the regional coordinator for Lynn and Benton counties and Eugene 4-H. And I am really excited to have you all here this afternoon to unlearn and learn with us in community as we work towards creating culturally relevant, responsive, and affirming outdoor school experiences for our students. If you could advance the slide, please. Just before I get started with a little bit of a context on this, this is going to be recorded. Welcome to those who are watching this after the fact. When we're talking about centering equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility in outdoor school, this is a conversation that we are trying to weave throughout our entire understanding of what outdoor school is, how we function as a program, and how we offer support to our providers and sites. But specifically within this context for this session, we're going to be going over our 2020 Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Grant Program that came about partly because of the pandemic and the response strategies, both statewide and nationwide, that had to be implemented because of the pandemic. The pandemic in 2020 meant that we had pretty much a virtual stop to in-person outdoor school programming, which was very upsetting to both our students and our providers and sites, but also we took that pause as a means to think about how to further support our providers and sites. And out of that came our EDI grant program. We had two grants, one that was an Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Program Improvement Grant, and a second one that was an Accessibility and Inclusion Site Improvement Grant that we offered up to sites and programs as they began to dig deep to see where were they in their equity journey, in their equity analysis, when they looked at their programming, when they looked at their sites, when they looked at the kinds of supports they can give their students and their staff. And once they had that answer, how could we further support them as they tried to deepen their knowledge and to ensure that they had more culturally relevant, responsive, and affirming programs. And so with us today, if you could advance the slide, we have 4 organizations who received grants and worked on their equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility of their programs. And they're going to be here today to give you an overview of what happened with their grants, any aha moments that they had as they've been going through the grants. The structure of our panel is each panelist is going to have about 10 minutes to give an overview of what they did within their own grant and what they propose to do. And then they are going to, as they're talking, we're going to really encourage you to put any questions that come up into the chat, and remember to put it into the chat for panelists and attendees so everybody can see them, unless there's something that you really would like just the panelists to see. And we're going to hold all of our questions until the end to ensure that our panelists have enough time to talk. And then at the end, we're going to go through our questions. If you have a question for a specific person or an organization, please make sure to include that in your question. For instance, if you're asking for Straub, you can say, Straub, how did this go within your grant, so that we know that it is specifically for Straub. If there is no organization or individual, we're going to assume that it is for the entire panel and give everybody in our panel a chance to speak and to answer that. I'm going to real quickly, briefly actually, give an introduction to our panelists, but they will likely introduce themselves as they are going through their presentations to give you a little bit more context. So we have Catherine Alexander, who is the Executive Director for Straub Outdoors, Suzanne Willow, who's the Interim Executive Director for the Crest, Emily Pinkowitz, who's the Education Director for Portland Audubon, and Charlie Peanut Anderson, who is the Executive Director for Camp Tamarack. So with that, I will pass it to Catherine.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here and to be able to share out and learn from everyone. Our JEDI, or Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion pathway began in 2016 when we were piloting a residential outdoor school, which was new for us. And we had done that with several non-Title I schools, and then had the opportunity to pilot with a Title I school. And 2 weeks before the outdoor school session, the school canceled. And the school administrator was apologetic, but said, our parents just are not signing the permission forms. And so we're going to have to cancel. They don't feel comfortable with the program as it is. And so we stopped and took notice because we had to. That was a big change, as you all can imagine. And internally, we talked and said, okay, what does this mean? What's happened? How do we address this? And what do we need to change in order to be able to serve this Title I school and other Title I schools with highly diverse populations? And we're based in the Mid-Willamette Valley, so that translates into about 40% of our students identify as Latinx or Hispanic Latino, depending on who's collecting the data. And so that started a very authentic, embracing internal and external discussion that really resulted in changing the DNA of our organization. And that involved increasing the diversity of our board, increasing the diversity of our staff, and increasing the bilingual capabilities of all of the above. We took that route rather than saying, so sorry, okay, I guess we're not going to be able to serve students like that. That just did not seem like an option for us, but that meant changing systemically. So in order to do that, we realized that increasing the diversity of our staff was absolutely necessary. We can't collect information if we don't have staff that represent the voices or that can talk the language literally and figuratively. So we embarked on that and had several multi-year grants to do that. And you can advance, thank you, to do that. And that allowed us to get to a point where we had developed a rubric for culturally responsive education. We'd increased the bilingual capabilities of our staff. We'd increased the diversity of our board, now more than 50% people of color. And that allowed us to have some authentic conversations with the community that we serve. And we did not feel, and I think we still all agree, that that would not have been possible without increasing our internal diversity. And that was difficult. Some people voluntarily resigned in order to make room for new voices. And that's going to include me one day. There will come a time when I am going to be replaced by someone who represents our community perhaps better than I do. And so that's a very strong commitment on the part of leadership, and we're glad we did that. What that allowed us to do is to have direct conversations through a qualitative research project with our community outreach engagement coordinator, which we hired with grant funds, Antonia Decker, and our education coordinator, Katie Gavadas, to talk with PAC members, which are parent advisory committee members that represent Title I schools. And they are our experts, and the students that they parent are our experts, and the classroom teachers that teach them are our experts. And what we got overwhelmingly was some information that some of which we expected and some of which we didn't. And if you want to progress to the next slide. So we had been thinking about it one way. If you can imagine the arrows going from the bottom up, we had developed programs that we thought were pretty awesome, and places that we thought were pretty magical and wonderful and ecologically rich. And our processes seemed like, there's nothing wrong with them. And the people who teach and the people who lead, well, we had some good people with heartful commitment. But what we realized is that if we didn't start with the people and change that structure, then everything else was not going to work. And it was a bestowing model of, hey, we've created this great thing. Now all we need to do is translate into Spanish and we're golden. That just simply was not the right way to approach it. And we learned by talking with initially the PAC members, the parents, and also the school community outreach coordinators at the Title I schools that we serve. And they were a wealth of information. They were interviews conducted in Spanish, conversations that often took place over dinner at people's homes. And then we used grounded theory to aggregate that and develop a theory of what was going on and what needed to happen, what their priorities were and their needs were. So starting with the people, and some of them are pictured in this slide, and then the process, and then the place. Where do they feel comfortable? What's a priority? What's of value to them? And then the program. And that means rebuilding everything from scratch. So we had just gotten to the point where we had rebuilt some programs, we had piloted them, we were ready to work with an education consultant to observe and coach. She had developed a rubric of culturally responsive education just before OSU was kind enough to develop one, and then COVID happened. So this EDI grant was so pivotal for us from OSU because it allowed us to continue the good work during the pandemic when we were still providing in-person education programs as an emergency childcare provider, and continue that good work. If you want to progress to the next slide. So in those qualitative interviews, which happened in 2017, and we're going to do them again and ongoing forever, this will have no end date, we found some really wonderful things that we had not expected. One is that when Latino families and students that identify as Latinx or Latino talk about nature, they really are talking about three different definitions of nature. And we need to be clear which definition we're talking about when we relate with them. One is the waterfalls and mountains that many of us think of with nature. Two is gardening and neighborhood walks and backyards, and that nature is nurturer, vegetables, fruits, harvesting in a home garden. And the third is rather negative in their mind, in their hearts, and that's agriculture, marginalized jobs, forestry, low wages, not consistent income. And so we needed to be clear which nature we were talking about with Outdoor School. The others that follow on this slide are just a few of the many takeaways that we got from those interviews. And I will say that the EDI grant that we received from OSU is helping us continue that work with the education coordinator, crosswalk the two rubrics, the one we developed with the one that OSU developed, and have some observations last year and this spring so that we can implement some of this newfound wisdom that people in our community were kind enough to share with us.
Thank you so much for sharing, Catherine. I'm going to pass it on now to Suzanne.
This is Suzanne Willow, and I am the executive director of the Crest, which is in the mountains outside Ashland, Oregon. We're at about 5,000 feet, and we are in the middle of a volcano. It erupted 22 million, years ago. And I have to tell you, I had a kindergartner ask me if I was there. So you'll notice I'm a little older than the rest of you. And this land is actually home site in addition to being homelands of the Upland, Takelma, Latgawa, and Athapascan people. And we have known home sites. And we've done a number of archaeologic studies, and we've worked with the Confederated Tribes of Branderand and Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, who are the people who were taken from this land, driven from this land, and are now in these Confederated tribal communities. So we ended up getting an accessibility grant specifically because this is a mountain. And this is kind of what you're seeing is one of the most level places, and it's a valley with mountains surrounding. And our campground, I considered it levelish and was told that it was nowhere close to levelish. And we have packed rock pathways, but we realized we really didn't have good parking. We didn't have good offloading for anyone in a wheelchair, for anyone with a walker, for anyone with a stroller. We have a fully accessible bathhouse from day one, and our kitchen, our cookhouse was mostly accessible, but not quite. But we didn't have any accessible housing. We're pretty rustic. We were hoping to have mostly tents on the ground with kids in bags, really being able to get kids out a bit. We heard from a lot of parents that they did not want their children on the ground, and they wanted their children either on platforms or in perhaps something like yurts. And the yurts, unfortunately, don't hold the snow that we get. We're in snow about 6 months of the year. So we switched, and go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And I don't know if this is going to be dark enough. It's really not very good. We worked with Michelle Mathis, who is a landscape architect at Learning Landscapes Designs, and looked at our campground, which basically consisted of the cookhouse that you see in the center and the bathhouse. And then our education circle is, as you see it on the screen, it's out to the side. It's number 9 up above there. What we decided to do was to build a series of tent cabins, wall tents that are all on concrete slabs. So, and all the pathways were widening. We had 4-foot wide pathways, packed rock, but not packed enough, especially in frost heave. We were losing accessibility. And so we've redesigned everything. All of our paths now are going to be packed rock and a lot more offloading areas, and the whole entire campground. This is a fairly level place. The whole thing is now wheelchair accessible. So we did that because we've had a number of schools that said, well, we just can't quite bring the kids up who are not as mobile, and we can't bring the kids who would not be comfortable specifically in a tent on the ground. And that was for the children rather than the parents specifically. And this is important because this whole area, I'm in the Rogue Valley, we're outside the Rogue Valley, up above it, and not an area that is easily accessible. And the Rogue Valley, of course, being a valley, experienced a terrible fire that destroyed 2 small towns and made about 2,400 homes, burned down 2,400 homes. So that was the first day of school of 2020. And it's called the Almeida Fire, when a lot of the other Oregon towns burned also. So these are the kids that we are bringing to our outdoor school. We have yet to do a residential outdoor school. We had planned the kids in tents on the ground for 2020, for the spring of 2020. And that didn't happen, of course, because of COVID. And then after the fire, we started looking around at what the community would need in order to be able to have kids feel at ease, specifically in a fire-prone area. We're in a forest. We have an open valley surrounded by 300 acres of forest. So how to open up that area, and that became this particular grant. But we also have trained all our instructors now in trauma-informed education, which became, of course, much more important during our summer program in 2020, when we did basically a childcare system outdoors, safe and distanced, and COVID safe and distanced, but the kids didn't feel safe. And so we'd done the ACEs training. We felt that we were able to be nurturing. We did not have a unified approach. And so now we have a unified approach to trauma-informed programs for all our programming. We have a few Title I schools that did come up last year. We did day programs only. We're doing day programs only this year. probably our biggest problem with this particular accessibility grant is that there are no contractors available down here at this point because they're all rebuilding houses. And the other part of that is that a 2x6 used to cost 78 cents a foot. Now it's $1.68 a foot for the same 2x6 for one board foot. So we have gone back and we'll be finishing our grant. We had to ask for more funds. We had to ask for more time. We now have a contractor who feels they can finish it this year. So let's go to the next slide, which is also a schematic. This is the farm area. We have a certified organic farm. We raise goats, chickens, and vegetables for our programs. And so this is an area that we also are needing and getting another grant from somebody else for accessibility for all of this. Again, it's on a hillside, but we are looking at going around our buildings and making everything much more accessible. So I'm going to sign off at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing what you've done so far, Suzanne. I'm going to pass it to Charlie.
Yeah, hello everyone. Charlie Peanut Anderson, he, him pronouns. Thank you all for being here. For Camp Tamarack, we are in Central Oregon and serve kids for outdoor school and summer camps. In listening to different people talk, I think one thing that we did as an organization about 5 years ago is we started looking at what are known as key performance indicators, or KPIs. We've actually moved this year to something that's called OKRs, which are objectives and key results. But by sitting down and looking at big picture, what do we want to achieve over the next 5 years? So thinking long term and also thinking short term too. What are the things that we want to accomplish? And one of those areas of need for us is how do we meet the needs of kids coming to our camps? And there were many holes that we had. Something that we're able to do for outdoor school is meet with the local school districts and their special services for their higher needs kids and determining how we can accommodate their needs while they're at camp. That gets them to camp, but our facilities are not still, we're getting better, but are not always accessible. And so when this grant came available, and Charlie, I don't know if you're doing it, but I'll just give thumbs up when it's ready to move to the next one. But for this particular grant, there were three main things that we were looking at. One was the accessibility for our dock. Canoeing is a part of what kids do when they come. Pathways, we have a lot of uneven pathways, so improving our pathways, accessibility to cabins and around camp. And then having someone come in with eyes that can, I guess, educate us on things that we don't necessarily see. So there's sometimes the obvious things that we all kind of know, but there are things that we don't see. And so those were the three big things that we were looking for in this grant. As we work through this process, I think we really heard from different people and learned a lot along the way. So whether that was OSU and pushing us to think big, talking to different manufacturers when it came to the dock that we were ultimately going to build. There was an organization or a company called K Access, and they really helped direct us into what would be most appropriate for our site. Empowering Access is the organization that's going to be doing did the site evaluation. And then Oregon Adaptive Sports is a local nonprofit that works with people in our community to be able to access the outdoors. So I think that for all of us, there's a number of people that are here listening or on the panel, but we're all at different places with our organizations. And so it's, where are you at as an organization? And then how do you continue to make steps to improve? And I think it's putting those things down so that you can have benchmarks for achieving certain goals. Empowering access, we still are waiting for that result. But I will say, when they came, they had people coming, some were in wheelchairs, some were blind, some were hard of hearing, and they all experienced camp in different ways. For us, we now have a little bit of a blueprint of things we can work on going forward to improve the access for our camp. So the things that we did for the access, there's the new dock. We're getting Moby mats, which help allow for wheelchairs to better access uneven spaces, and the pathway improvements. This is, you can just kind of see our old dock. We thought it was pretty cool and pretty nice, but really when it comes to accessibility, not so great. So our new dock came just before the snow started falling. So it's actually in bits and pieces and will be assembled this spring once the snow melts. But if you go to the next slide, you'll kind of see what it's going to ultimately look like. And it will just allow for people to be able to access their canoe or kayak much easier. We used to make it work and we would lift kids up into canoes, but it probably best practices wasn't the best for that. So we'll be much better off. I'm keeping you on your toes. This is just a picture of someone accessing a kayak using the system that we'll have at camp. By us putting in this dock, not only does it open up the opportunity for us to service the kids that are coming to camp, but those partnerships that we're able to develop going forward. So Oregon Adaptive Sports is now going to be able to come out in the summertime. There's a day where they're planning to have families come and spend the day out on the lake, canoeing, kayaking, paddleboarding, but being able to access the facilities that we now have in place. So it's expanded how we're able to service our community. And this is just another picture of how we're ultimately working to improve our pathways. We do not have ramps getting up into our cabins at this time. This is something that we're ultimately going to be working towards. Again, we've made it work, but it's just not best practices. So the things we're working on improving the signage. So we're actually going to have Braille out in front of cabins, the signage in Spanish and English, our website, updating it to make it more accessible for families to see what is available at camp. And then also for our community to see what's available too. So that is it for Camp Tamarack. But again, I look forward to the questions and how we can all kind of continue to work forward, moving forward to improve accessibility for all people.
Thanks, Peanut. Emily?
Hey everyone, I'm Emily. I'm the Director of Education at Portland Audubon, and I wanted to also give a shout out to Abby Van Leuven, who's our School and Outdoor Partnership Specialist. She also works closely with our after school program and is integral to the work that we're doing. Next slide. New mission that we're working with at Portland Audubon Education is to build a thriving, diverse communities in nature, working together to make a difference. And we do a lot of different programs. So we do camps, we do field trips, we do youth leadership, we do programs for adults, and we work across the state. So we have sanctuaries all the way out on the coast, and our most well-known one is in downtown, north of downtown Portland, the southern end of Forest Park. But the site we're going to be talking about today is Marmot Cabin. It's located outside of Sandy, Oregon, and between 2017 and 2019, we completely redesigned this cabin, and we were excited to open up and start programs. Go to the next slide. But something that we thought about as we were looking at this kind of gorgeous new space is how can we ensure that this beautiful new space is available to students and families from all socioeconomic communities, especially from communities that have been historically disenfranchised. Our site is small. It can only fit as many as 60 kids. So we really had to think strategically about what's met and how we could avoid just being like a boutique site for a limited number of students. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, and also how can we ensure that the experience once they come is positive, culturally resonant, and restorative? So we worked with OSU to apply for a 3-part kind of project. The first was to focus on dismantling staffing bias. You can do the next slide. And we wanted to kind of think about how to audit and rebuild our staffing practices with a focus on racial and economic justice. The second was listen to our community. And we wanted to meet with key stakeholders from schools and low-income communities of color, and also with larger outdoor school providers to figure out what our niche might be. And then the third was to develop and pilot a scalable model, starting small with 1 to 2 schools. We were really grateful to have a partner in this work and collaborator with Experience Life Science Outdoors, which is an organization that is focused on the Black and Brown experience in the outdoors, centering their voice, centering their stories, and elevating the ways of knowing of Black and Brown communities. Next slide. And I really wish that they could be here today. They had a scheduling conflict, but we're indebted to them, and this is very much a partnership in every sense, working with Srinivasa Brown, who's the executive director, Tony Funchess, who is our facilitator, and then Erin Carthett, who's the project manager and has a lot of experience at our school. So what they worked on with us is taking us through the SURSET and also doing some culturally responsive teaching training, hosting listening sessions, both with outdoor school providers and school and family members from our pilot schools, and then identifying the 2 schools and looking at curriculum. And we've done a lot so far. It was ambitious and we've made a lot of progress. Thank you so much to Benno, Andrea, Sunshine, Spirit, Stephen, Darcy for talking with us. And we're very excited to have 2 schools that we're working with. I want to share a little bit about what we've learned. So in terms of dismantling staffing bias, being good at this takes time. Culturally responsive teaching is not something that you can learn in a couple-hour workshop. And so it has to be paired, as Catherine said, it has to be paired with hiring practices. We currently have mostly seasonal educators. And when we did our initial search for educators, even though we talked a lot about looking for people with a high level cultural competency, with experience working with communities of color, with lived experience they can draw from, we had only, I think, 2 applicants of color. So you can go to the next slide. We are beginning to look at approaches to pathways and hiring specifically, because training can only take you so far. And I'm really in awe of Catherine and your work. I'd love to talk more with you. And then also, I think one of the most vital things we learned is that without deep cultural safety, the line between character building and trauma is really blurry. So it was really interesting to listen to some of the descriptions of kind of what was viewed as positive experiences that outdoor school providers shared about, kids having anxiety, curled up in a ball on the floor, wanting to go home. And then the next day they're fine, they're having a great time. And what also heard from that experience was actually, this is a child in trauma, and that perhaps our sense of building grit in a child, what that means and what that looks like, and what it indicates might be different than what we might think or assume within the outdoor school community. And so this really relates to the idea that who is listening really matters. And that's why I'm really grateful to have Elsa as a partner. And I also think that one of the most important pieces that we've learned is that honest feedback is a product of trust, and trust takes time and showing up. So, and just to relate, that's okay, that's fine. Karen, you can do the next. I know I'm like, something that came up repeatedly is, you go to a community and you ask them for feedback. And maybe you think, oh, well, I'll pay them. That's what's in it for them. I'm going to offer them feedback. But then feedback that they share is not particularly honest, because they don't know you, they don't trust you. There's no reason for them to be honest with you necessarily, and you're paying them, and so they might be worried about saying something that you might find problematic. And so Sharzi actually asked this question when we met her, what is in it for them? Why are we asking them to share their insights with us, and what can they get out of that? So we took a step back and started thinking, okay, instead of this being about what do we need and what do we want to know, how can we just listen to schools to understand what they need right now? And maybe in the process of plugging in with the school, we can begin to glean some of the answers that we're looking for, but in a way that's less about transactional or exploitative and more about relationships. And what we learned from the 2 schools we spoke with is that schools are really struggling right now. They're struggling for bodies, they're struggling for time outside. One principal described it as, you know, I am standing in a burning building with no fire gear and asking teachers to come in. And that was really compelling and upsetting to realize here we're focused on our little project. Meanwhile, we have this tremendous capacity as outdoor education providers to provide a real service to children that are struggling. So our goal for the coming months is not just to ask questions, but to actually join the community to find ways to show up in ways that are useful to the school. And in the process of doing that, begin to ask those questions that we want to ask, but in a way that is a product of a relationship. So what's next? We're investing in educators. So we're working with ELSA to create a train the trainer model for all of our seasonal educators, but we're also looking at increasing permanent positions so that we can really do robust hiring searches and find educators that can work with the partner schools that we're working with that have lived experience as people of color that they can draw from and that their students can connect to. And we're also working with ELSA to develop pathways for hiring and training new BIPOC educators in seasonal capacities as well. We decided to focus on 4th and 5th grade, and that's because, you know, realistically, the vast majority of students are going to go to MESD or Northwest Regional in the Portland area. And we realized that we have a unique niche to play in perhaps scaffolding that experience by creating a bridge experience in 4th or 5th grade that gives them the opportunity to find their growing edge in terms of being outside, gives us the opportunity to work with families to build that comfort with letting their students go outside and be away from home, as Catherine mentioned, but in a community that's safe, so that they're not simultaneously dealing with a new place, being away from home, being with students from all over the city, being with educators who are predominantly from cultural communities that don't reflect their own, and that's a lot to ask of a student at the same time, and that by building a bridge experience where some of those parameters are kind of reduced, those potential for trauma, we can perhaps give them a more robust foundation to work from. And part of that is that it takes time to build relationships, engage families and community. And so we are going to be working to build that trust with families over the course of the year, that by the time they're going on this bridge experience, they know who we are, know what the places that their kids are going to, they've had input into what the program looks like. They also see us as part of their community in a more robust way than just as outdoor school providers. Whoops, that's my timer. So as I said, we're going to show up with teachers throughout the year. We're creating experiences based on what they want and need. And in the process of that, we're hoping to get at that same listening. We maybe would have done that through, hosting an event where we offer to pay people a stipend to ask them questions, but it's in a way in which people really trust us and are sharing this feedback because it's meaningful for them because we have a relationship with them.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
a New Yorker, I talk really fast, so I'm sorry if that was a little too much.
No, thank you so much for sharing, Emily, and thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their experiences with these grants with us. For our audience, I hope it gave you a little bit of an insight on the different projects that folks are working with, whether they were doing a site accessibility grant or working on a program equity and accessibility grant, just to see the variety that is needed within our state. And so right now we'd like to give over the rest of our time together to our audience for questions to our panelists. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand if you would like to speak and add your voice into this space. As some of you might be kind of processing all the information that you just received and putting your questions to pen. I have a question just around, as you all were working on your grants, from what you proposed to do to what your final project ended up being, what are some shifts that you think are important for other providers and sites to think about as they're diving into equity work or deepening their equity work in outdoor school?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on this, but I really appreciate that question, because I think the big shift was viewing this through the perspective of like, what does the community as a whole need? How does our skill set plug into that? And how can outdoor school be a part of that? As opposed to thinking we have this incredible outdoor school program that we want to make better, but how can we listen to you to find out what can make it better? And I think that also helped us think about shifting from, okay, we have to be a outdoor school for all 6th grade provider because, you know, that's what the state is paying for, you know, to being like, okay, what is our niche? Like, what can we offer? How can we make sure that what we can offer is available to schools that really need it in the moment when they really need it? I would say those are the two biggest shifts from when we started.
I think it came up in almost each person is, I do think the importance of talking to the people that are going to ultimately be accessing your program and knowing who those people are and how can you be of service to them in the best way.
This is Suzanne. I think the one of the things that came up for us was we're working with somebody about fire ecology, and she has a child with autism. And another family said, you know, my child has autism and would love to come, but talk to me about structure. And it was wonderful to talk to them about structure and learn about the additional, not only physical structure, but emotional safe space structure that we can put in place along with our ADA accessibility.
And I really appreciate how every panelist so far has really, even though it was the title of Emily's presentation, Let's Get Relational, you all touched on how you worked with community, how you hired consultants from specific social identities who could look at a campsite or a program and really share what was missing or what was what might not be obvious to those of us who don't hold those identities, so that we're really trying to include, be more accessible, be more equitable and inclusive. And I really appreciated how it came out in everybody's presentation. There's a question in the chat from Priscilla, and I would say this is probably for Charlie and Suzanne. How do you prioritize projects to address various accessibility or inclusion issues?
Well, I guess our first was getting kids up off the ground and realizing the kids can't get on the ground, as I can't much anymore, and realizing that we needed to really change. We don't want to build big buildings. We have a very rustic place, but what could we do that fit within our sense of not taking over the land with buildings, but really make kids comfortable and have a space that is physically accessible, but also is going to be comfortable for the kids. And I think that was the realizing that of course not only the housing, but then the pathways and bringing in especially the students with autism specifically, we shifted to making small places. We shifted to making small enclosed places and places that were not as, my picture is, oh, look, it's out there, let's go. That's not going to work. That doesn't work for a lot of people. And so I think that was that we had the plan first to do the pathways. We already had the bathhouse. We actually want to build another one now, and the same plan that we already had. And looking at our cookhouse, at how making it much more open physically inside. We're not doing the size of it. It's still a small space, but I think that was really it, was looking at each piece. And we had a pretty good idea in the first place, but then realizing what could we do with other spaces, such as getting kids into our barn to see the goats. It has concrete, we just need to make a ramp. So learning that as we go along.
Do you have anything to add, Peanut?
I see lots of other questions. I could just say, like, I mean, it's thinking big picture. So like, you're not going to be able to necessarily build that new big thing this year, but if you have that big plan, but also what are those little things you can do along the way? Great. This year we're going to do this and we're going to do this, and that big thing's still there, but what can you do right now?
Thank you. So we have a question for Audubon and Straub. How do you effectively shift staffing biases and hiring practices? What are the next steps for diversifying staff? What changes need to be made for our programs to offer desirable jobs for people of color?
I can dive in if that's okay, Emily. So we switched over the last 2 years from the seasonal staff is a huge issue. The seasonal nature of staff and the pay rate is a huge issue, because if we're going to just call this out, it's people of privilege that can afford to be underemployed because they often have family resources that other people don't have, and they usually have a cushion that other people don't have. And so we need to be able to offer not just living wage jobs, but family wage jobs if we're really going to make these positions accessible to all. And so we switched. So our education team is now almost entirely full years salaried. And anybody that's done payroll, you can appreciate what we just did. And so it requires a little bit of some white knuckle, but we're going to make that work. And the reason why is that in costing out how much that costs to do that churn over the season, it wasn't benefiting anybody. It wasn't benefiting the employees, our staff, our education team. It wasn't benefiting our organization. It was such a heavy lift to train for what is such a pivotal educational opportunity. We believe, and we hope our schools believe too, that it was worth investing, because then we're not going to have that churn. Also, we reframed what we're looking for in an employee. So rather than looking for a whole bunch of people with environmental science and ecology degrees, we love those, we have those, but we expanded what constitutes the kind of experience base. Is a degree in community health something? Yes, that's absolutely relevant. Is being a mom count as childcare experience? Yes, that does. And so expanding what we considered minimum qualifications to be more inclusive was a game changer. And then as far as I want to touch on showing up for teachers and staff, there's a really easy way, and it's really monumental for staff and for schools. We are going to be volunteering in the schools that we serve, particularly Title I schools, as reading buddies, math mentors, and whatever else they need. We're just going to show up, and we're going to help out the teachers with some of those students that especially now need writing support, math support. Has nothing to do with outdoor education, has everything to do with building relationships and just being there. So that's one, and I don't think as soon as they allow volunteers, anybody will say no if you show up and pay your staff to volunteer a few hours a week in the school.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I have such a crush on your organization. I think the work you're doing is amazing. I think we're at 2017 of that trajectory, so that's exactly where we're at too. We're trying to shift towards more permanent positions because I think that's important. I also think if you are going to have seasonal staff, that you look at at what point in a person's life does that employment work for that, and how can you adjust your qualifications that you're looking for to match the point in a person's life. So this is not in the outdoor school season, but during the summer, we're looking at hiring more teenagers for whom maybe a salary that for someone with a master's degree in environmental education is untenable, but for a young person who's at the beginning of their career is a good wage. And with ALSO, we're starting to look at think about all of the programs that exist in Portland area, specifically working with people of color in the outdoors during the school year, which is a lot for high school students. And how can we start to think about how to partner with them in terms of our staffing as well? So we're just in the beginning stages, but trying to adjust. If you can't create full-time jobs and increase the pay, then you have to increase the expectations and put more time into training, so that you can bring people along who are at a point in their career where that seasonality and pay is more acceptable than it would be for people further along. And in terms of showing up, I think that's amazing, and we've been talking about that too. They have one of the schools that we're working with has an office, and can we work out of that office sometimes? But it's also like doing science programming. One of the schools that we're working in, science wasn't a subject that was taught in the school until the new principal joined a few years ago. So providing more regular science programs throughout the year is also something that we're talking about doing. And then also just being present for community events. We went to their Harvest Festival. We've offered to do childcare for parent-teacher conferences. So just these moments when might need help that is not necessarily about forwarding our objectives, but fits with what they need.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to apologize that we don't have enough time for all of these questions. However, I've saved the chat, so I will find a way to get all of these questions answered for you all and post it somewhere where you all can see them, so they are not going to waste because they're really awesome questions. Kieran is going to put a link to our evaluation into the chat that we would love you all to be able to take. And I also just want to offer up that if you have a question for a specific panelist, please reach out to them and see if you can meet them in one of our campfire spaces, or if you are not able to stay for the campfire space, find out their email and reach out directly and see if you can get those relationships and start networking, because outdoor school is a community and we are stronger if we work together and are able to share what we have learned, where we have failed, where we're getting successes, and that's just going to make the entire network stronger. So I really just encourage you to reach out to folks. But again, I will find a way to get these answers to these questions for everybody, because they're really great questions and I think they'll be helpful for everybody to get answers to. And so Kieran put the link in for our evaluation. Our next session starts at 3. It's going to be concurrent sessions. So make sure you have the website open for the gathering. I will stay on for a few more moments. If anybody has anything pressing that they really need to get an answer to, but don't worry about the questions. We will get them answered and we will get you connected to these folks. But thank you again to our panelists for everything that they've shared. And thank you so much to our audience for the great questions you were posing in the chat.